Hello, and thank you for joining us for a presentation on the history of the U.S. Postal Service. As the first American communications network, our postal system not only aided commerce and strengthened the bonds of family and friendship, it helped create a nation. Letters and newspapers exchanged through the mail helped forge an American national identity and advance national policies. Historically, in many communities, the postmaster, who ran the local post office, was the federal government, and the regular arrival of U.S. mail was citizens' most tangible government benefit. Today, nearly 250 years later, the Postal Service is still delivering for America. It's our only information network that, by law, must provide service to the whole country, delivering to every community, whether it's profitable or not. Benjamin Franklin, the founding father of the Postal Service, was an ingenious inventor, but even he would be amazed if he saw the technology being used in postal facilities today. But before we jump ahead, let's look back and explore the origins of the Postal Service and how it's evolved to serve our growing nation.
The first official record of mail service in the American colonies dates to 1639, when the General Court of Massachusetts designated a tavern in Boston as the post office for all letters coming from or going overseas. At the time, the city was 9 years old and had about 1,200 residents. In 1673, monthly mail service was established between New York and Boston, but it was short-lived. In 1692, the Crown granted Thomas Neal, a British politician, the exclusive right to operate a postal system in the colonies. The Crown bought back the rights and assumed control of the system in 1707.
This 1729 map of part of North America shows just over a dozen post offices, including the three great offices, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The most noteworthy actions of the British-run postal system, from our perspective, were the appointments of Benjamin Franklin as Postmaster of Philadelphia and later as Joint Postmaster General for the North American colonies. Postmasters are in charge of a particular post office, whereas the Postmaster General is in charge of the entire postal system. Scientist, author, printer, postmaster, statesman. Benjamin Franklin has been the second most popular subject for U.S. stamps, with more than 100 issued in his honor, beginning with one of the first two stamps issued in 1847. Born in Boston, Franklin ran away to Philadelphia at age 17 and found work as a printer. By 1728, he had his own print shop and soon bought and began publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette. In 1732, at the age of 26, he first published Poor Richard's Almanac, which was wildly successful and secured his fortune. Franklin's almanac was full of words of wisdom, like, "A good example is the best sermon," and "Speak little, do much." In his life, Franklin did more than most. His postal career began in 1737, when he was appointed postmaster of Philadelphia. Running the post office was beneficial to newspaper printers, since it helped them both gather and distribute the news. Philadelphia's previous postmaster, who printed a rival newspaper, had barred Franklin's Gazette from the mail. In 1753, after serving as postmaster of Philadelphia for 16 years, Franklin was appointed Joint Postmaster General for the Crown. Franklin introduced several improvements, including a better accounting system and night riding by post riders. Post riders were the first mail carriers. They transported mail from town to town on horseback. In addition to speeding up the post riders, Franklin printed the very first postage rate chart. This chart lists postage rates, not in dollars and cents, but in pennyweights and grains of silver, the currency used in 1765 when it was printed. Thanks in part to Franklin's efforts, the British postal system in North America turned its first profit in 1760. While still serving as Postmaster General, Franklin went to London to represent the interests of several colonial governments. Peaceful relations between the colonies and Great Britain became strained in the 1760s when the British government passed a series of laws which irritated the colonies and ultimately united them in opposition to the Crown. In January 1774, Benjamin Franklin was dismissed as Joint Postmaster General for the Crown because he was judged too sympathetic to the colonies. In the early 1770s, committees of correspondence were formed so that colonists could communicate about politics with like-minded citizens. After Benjamin Franklin was dismissed as Postmaster General for the Crown, he warned that the British postal system was not a safe channel for this sort of communication. British officials could open and read letters, and authors of letters promoting rebellion could be hanged for treason. Instead, the committees of correspondence exchanged letters using special messengers. And you can see on this slide, this letter has no postage marks. It was carried by a special messenger. In September 1774, 12 of the 13 American colonies sent delegates to meet in Philadelphia to discuss organized resistance to the British. This was the First Continental Congress. Meanwhile, William Goddard, a newspaper printer and former postmaster, devised a plan for an American postal system, independent of the British. He crisscrossed the colonies, promoting his constitutional post. Several colonies adopted his plan, establishing post offices that later continued under the Continental Congress. Goddard pitched his postal plan to the delegates at the First Continental Congress, but no action was taken until after the first shots were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. In May of 75, a Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia to plan for the defense of the colonies. Because the circulation of letters and intelligence was critical to their cause, Congress appointed a committee to consider the creation of a postal system. The committee reported its plan to Congress on July 25, 1775. On July 26, 1775, Congress agreed to the committee's plan, creating the position of Postmaster General and naming Benjamin Franklin to the job. The U.S. Postal Service traces its origin to that day, when Benjamin Franklin was appointed Postmaster General of the United Colonies, the predecessor to the United States.
When Benjamin Franklin took office, nearly 70 post offices operated in the United Colonies, mostly along the Atlantic coast. Most of those offices are still operating today. This slide shows the original post offices still in operation in 2020. During the Revolutionary War, the postal system mainly carried communications between Congress and the armies in the field. Keeping the lines of communication open was so important that many postmasters provided service at great personal sacrifice. In November 1776, Ebenezer Hazard, postmaster of New York, wrote to a friend in Congress that not only did he face extraordinary out-of-pocket expenses due to the war, but he'd been following General George Washington from camp to camp on foot for lack of a horse. Postmaster Mary Catherine Goddard of Baltimore, William Goddard's sister, kept her office open for several years by paying the postwriter out of her own pocket. She was also a printer. In January 1777, Congress commissioned Mary Catherine Goddard to print the first copy of the Declaration of Independence with the names of the signers. With British troops closing in on Philadelphia, Congress had evacuated to Baltimore the previous month. Our founders considered the circulation of intelligence key not only to winning the war, but also to surviving as a new nation. Not only did Army commanders communicate by mail, but democracy itself was a radical experiment, and its success, they believed, depended on having informed voters. The main sources of information at that time were newspapers delivered by mail. In 1781, the same year that the British surrendered at Yorktown, Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, which kept the post office under the control of Congress. The U.S. Constitution kept the post office under congressional authority. It gives Congress the power to, quote, establish post offices and post roads in Article 1, Section 8. A post road is any route over which mail travels, as designated by Congress. By controlling post roads, Congress ensured that the Postal Service would serve the whole nation rather than particular areas or communities. A collection of federal laws known as the Private Express Statutes gave the post office a monopoly on letter delivery along post roads. This was so that private delivery companies couldn't provide service only on profitable routes, leaving only money-losing routes to the post office, which would then need to be funded by taxpayers versus postage payers. Notice on this slide that Congress declared steamboat routes to be post roads beginning in 1823. Railroads were added in 1838, and since 1884, all public roads have been designated as post roads. The scope and scale of the Postal Service increased along with the nation, from 75 post offices nationwide in 1790 to more than 76,000 in 1900. The postal network, which ended in Kentucky in the 1790s, reached California in the 1840s. Mail first reached California by ship via Panama in 1849. Overland routes were added in the 1850s. The longest was Butterfield's Overland Mail Route, which connected the East with San Francisco via St. Louis and Memphis, beginning in 1858. One trip along the 2,800-mile-long route took about 22 days. Stagecoach travel was not only slow, but painful. Potholes and ruts in unpaved roads would repeatedly bump you into fellow passengers. On a bad day, the whole coach might overturn due to a poor road, or you might get attacked by robbers. But even on the best day, in a full stagecoach, 9 people squeezed inside, in such close quarters that 6 of them, facing each other, sometimes had to interlock their legs. A battle-tested lieutenant in the British Royal Navy traveled overland from California to Kansas in 1865. He later recalled, quote, "I can remember no night of horror equal to the first night's travel on the overland route." He described jolts to the carriage that would, quote, "strike the cranium violently against the roof," and a carriage so crowded that passengers couldn't help occasionally hitting each other. In 1860, a private company formed to carry mail to California in just 10 days, using a relay system of mounted express riders. It was soon called the Pony Express. Speedy service came at a price, initially $5 per half ounce. That would be about $150 in today's money, and that was versus 3 or 10 cents for a letter sent by regular mail. Despite the high prices, or maybe because of them, the company never made a profit. In July 1861, the Pony Express began operating under contract as a U.S. mail route. The service ended just 4 months later, as soon as the transcontinental telegraph line was completed. Despite its short life, the Pony Express remains one of the most enduring legends of the West. But the Postal Service didn't just keep pace with national growth, it spurred growth. Since colonial times, nearly all mail has been transported under contract. The first mail carriers were post riders. In fact, from 1837 to 1970, a post rider was at the center of the official postal seal. But to encourage national development from 1785 to 1860, Congress directed the Postmaster General to contract for mail transportation by stagecoach on some mail routes, not because the mail volume required it, but to encourage the growth of stage lines to connect and expand the nation.
Congress expanded access to mail service, not only by following the frontier, but also by cutting postage rates. At first, letters were charged by the sheet of paper and were expensive to mail, the equivalent of a quarter day's wage for many people. And people didn't use envelopes. That would have counted as an extra sheet, doubling the cost of postage. To save money on postage, people also sometimes cross-wrote their letters, which could have left readers cross-eyed. In 1845, postage rates were slashed, in some cases by more than 2/3. Rates were also simplified. The 5 distance-based letter rate categories were reduced to 2. In 1851, Congress dropped postage rates even lower. And in 1863, distance-based letter rate categories were abandoned, and all letters were given the lowest rate. Since that time, letter rates have been uniform, that is, based solely on weight and not on destination. For the same price, you can mail a letter to your next-door neighbor or to someone in Hawaii. Newspaper postage has always been much cheaper than letter postage. In some cases, newspapers were mailed for free. For over a century, newspapers were our main source of information. George Washington wanted all newspapers to travel through the mail for free. From the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, the postage rate for newspapers was roughly 1 penny per pound versus 2 cents or more per ounce for a letter. In addition to spreading mail service from coast to coast and lowering postage rates, Congress introduced new services as the 19th century progressed. In 1863, Congress authorized free home delivery from post offices where the office revenue could pay for it. Before, postage had paid only for the delivery of mail to an addressee's post office. Within a year, free delivery was offered in 65 cities. By 1900, nearly 800 cities had free delivery. Initially, carriers handed mail to customers. They used door knockers to save their knuckles, and sometimes used whistles. But waiting at doors still cost carriers up to 30 minutes a day. By 1912, new customers were required to provide mail slots or boxes, and since 1923, all customers have been required to have a mailbox or slot to get mail. This was in cities. Rural customers have always needed a mailbox. Free home delivery in the countryside, called Rural Free Delivery, or RFD, began in 1896. RFD brought mail directly to farms. Before that, farmers had to make lengthy periodic trips into town to check for mail. The delivery network grew rapidly. The number of rural carriers skyrocketed from fewer than 500 in 1899 to more than 32,000 in 1905. Route mileage increased dramatically early on, and the number of rural routes is still increasing. The introduction of rural delivery encouraged the road improvement, since drivable roads were a prerequisite for free delivery. Rural delivery contributed to a postcard craze in the first decades of the 20th century. Women especially benefited and contributed to the growing popularity of postcards, which cost only a penny to mail for most years until 1952. One study found that women sent 3 times as many postcards as men and received 4 times as many. The Postmaster General emphasized the role that RFD had in easing social isolation, which hit women especially hard. In 1907, the Postmaster General shared the medical belief that RFD decreased insanity among rural customers. Postcards 100 years ago were like the tweets or memes of today. People sent jokey postcards, wish you were here type postcards, and even leather postcards, which could be collected and sewn into cushions. Social commentators and etiquette experts were horrified by people's propensity to overshare using this new social media. In 1903, one journalist complained there are people who would write anything on a postal, from a recipe for fruitcake to the last quarrel they had with their husbands. In 1913, parcel post was introduced. Previously, 4 pounds had been the weight limit for shipping parcels via the U.S. mail. Anything heavier was shipped via express companies or railroads. This had put a lot of merchandise out of reach for many Americans. Harper's Weekly quipped, "Express companies extend their business wherever it promises to pay. The post office extends its operations wherever there are settlers." Parcel post, combined with rural delivery, fueled the growth of mail order firms like Montgomery Ward and Sears, opening up a new world of shopping opportunity for many Americans. 300 million packages were mailed in the first 6 months of parcel post. The first year, Sears filled 5 times as many orders as it had the year before. College students also benefited from parcel post. They could mail their dirty laundry home. People mailed all kinds of unexpected items, from eggs to little girls, and even, brick by brick, a bank. Now, although it was against postal regulations, several children traveled via U.S. mail in the early years of parcel post. And in some remote parts of the country, parcel post rates were so much cheaper than the rates charged by private carriers that literally tons of material traveled by mail, including the 37 tons of bricks to help build a bank in Vernal, Utah, which still stands today.
At the same time that the post office was expanding services, it was also speeding delivery. This map shows how the quickening of transportation shrank the perceived size of the country. The large map represents the size of the country in the stagecoach era. Here we see how much smaller the country seemed when the Transcontinental Railroad opened. And the tiny map at the top represents how much air travel seemed to shrink the size of the country. When railroads came along in the 1830s, the post office quickly embraced them. For nearly a century, from the 1870s to the 1950s, they were the primary mode of mail transportation. Mail on trains not only traveled faster, it traveled smarter. Railway mail clerks expedited delivery by sorting mail aboard trains as they rumbled to their destination. To save even more time, clerks exchanged mail at some post offices on the fly while the train was still in motion. In this silent film from 1903, you see the postmaster hanging up the outgoing mail bag. We'll see a train approach. A clerk on board the train grabs the bag like a jousting knight, while another clerk tosses off the incoming mail bag. There it goes. Next, you'll see the same type of transfer made in 1956.
Now watch how they catch mail on the fly with the help of a mail messenger. 10 minutes before the train is scheduled to pass a non-stop station, the mail messenger carefully hangs the special catcher pouch of mail. After it is securely fastened, top and bottom, he steps aside and waits nearby to witness the catch and receive any mail which may be thrown off. Aboard the train, local mail is being tied out as the clerk spots his landmark. This was it. must get every letter package for this dispatch in the pouch and tied out. The race against time and speed was on. As soon as the last pouch was made ready, the clerk grabs his safety goggles and goes to his station. The engineer is required to signal the RPO car that they are approaching a non-stop station. And a dramatic moment is at hand.
In 1918, the Post Office Department took to the sky. With steamships and railroads, the department had always contracted with private companies, but when airmail started, there was no aviation industry. So the Post Office created one, building airfields, using its own pilots, planes, and mechanics, and fine-tuning flight instruments and navigational aids on the ground. By the end of 1920, airmail routes had been established from New York to San Francisco. At first, mail was flown only during daylight. Beginning in 1924, mail was flown day and night, taking New York mail to San Francisco in about a day and a half. In 1926, the department began contracting out airmail service, and many U.S. air carriers, including Delta, American, and United, owe their existence partly to airmail contracts they were awarded in the 1920s and 30s. There was little passenger traffic at first. Air travel was just too risky. 34 airmail pilots died on the job from 1918 to 1927, and there were more than 5,000 forced landings. Here's footage from a 1923 cross-country flight. In Wyoming, the pilot packed snowshoes, canned food, and even a rifle, so he might survive if his plane went down in the Rocky Mountains. The Postal Service was not only a transportation pioneer, it was also a leader in workforce diversity. Postmasters were the first female managers in the federal government. You've already heard about Mary Catherine Goddard, who served as postmaster of Baltimore in the 18th century. Women continued to serve as postmasters throughout history. There was an uptick in their numbers directly after the Civil War, when many men in the South were unable to take the loyalty oath. After the Civil War, too, African Americans began working throughout the Postal Service. James Mason, the first known African American postmaster, was appointed at Sunnyside, Arkansas in 1867 and served until about 1871. Mason wore many hats. He was also a state senator, a county judge, and later a county sheriff. The first known African American letter carrier was James Christian, who began delivering mail in Richmond, Virginia in 1869. Later that same year, William Carney began delivering mail in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Carney is better known for being the first African American to earn a Congressional Medal of Honor for courage in battle during the Civil War. The bravery displayed by Carney and the rest of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment during the Union's assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, inspired the 1989 movie Glory. Post offices were an important source of work for urban African Americans in the early and mid-1900s, when there were few opportunities in the private sector. Postal employment helped create the black middle class. Postal employees elevated not only their own families, but entire communities. Several black letter carriers were prominent civil rights leaders. A director of the NAACP recalled that whenever he visited towns in the 1950s and 60s looking for volunteers to lead civil rights activities, he would call upon, quote, the minister, the undertaker, the lawyer, and the post office worker. Women served as mail carriers, transporting mail to post offices, by 1845, as rural letter carriers, delivering directly to rural customers, by 1899, as village carriers delivering to residents of small towns by 1918, and began delivering mail experimentally in cities during the two world wars.
But few women worked as letter carriers until the 1960s, when President John F. Kennedy ordered that federal appointments and promotions be made without regard to sex. Since the 1960s, you can see that the number of women city carriers has more than doubled.
In the 1960s, low wages for federal workers led to the hiring of more women as clerks in large post offices, because men could find better paying jobs elsewhere. Postal supervisors struggled with increasing absenteeism because women were more likely to miss work due to sick children or family crises. At the same time, the post office department was struggling with outdated and crowded facilities. Many of the largest post offices had been built in the 1930s and were designed to receive mail by rail. They didn't have enough docking space for large trucks, which began replacing trains as the primary mail movers in the 1950s. Further stressing the system, mail volume was up 230% between 1940 and 1960. Postal management was in a bind. Congress held the purse strings. All important business decisions were made by Congress. This led to artificially low rates of postage, which were popular, but also led to a stagnant postal infrastructure. In 1966, the Chicago Post Office became gridlocked by mail, with trucks unable to unload. At one point, it was estimated that 300 tractor trailers waited in a line that wound around the Chicago Post Office. At that time, Chicago had the world's largest post office. It took about a month to clear the logjam, made national news headlines, and helped ignite a movement for postal reform. After much debate, Congress passed the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970. The Postal Reorganization Act transformed the U.S. Post Office Department into the United States Postal Service, a self-supporting organization no longer funded by tax dollars. The new USPS officially began operations on July 1st, 1971, almost 50 years ago. The Postal Reorganization Act created an independent Postal Rate Commission, now the Postal Regulatory Commission, to recommend new postage rates. The Act also created a Board of Governors to act on those recommendations and to serve a role similar to a board of directors of a private corporation. Although Congress expected the Postal Service to support itself, like a business, it also expected it to continue to operate for the public good. By law, it was not allowed to make a profit. In 2006, Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, which brought major changes to postal laws, and now allows the Postal Service to make a profit, although so far it has been a moot point. On the heels of the 2006 Act, the Great Recession hit, resulting in much less mail. Most mail is business related, so any hit to the economy impacts mail volume. Year by year, more mail has also been diverted to electronic media like email and the internet. For most of its history, the Postal Service was challenged with delivering more mail to more addresses, but since 2007, it has faced a new challenge. Delivering less mail, using only its own revenue, and with its ability to cut costs constrained by Congress, to an ever-expanding delivery network. Postal management has responded by cutting costs within its control and by asking Congress for the legislative changes needed to cut more costs. To help keep mail relevant in today's digital world, the Postal Service has introduced a number of innovations, including postage discounts for large mailers who make the mail digitally interactive, and new services like informed delivery, which gives people a virtual sneak peek of their daily mail. In our lifetime, The biggest change in the Postal Service has not come in the services provided or in how mail is transported, but in how it's processed. Here's a short film from 1903 showing clerks sorting letters. Although letter sorting machines were tested as early as the 1920s, most letters were still sorted manually, using the pigeonhole method of Benjamin Franklin's day. At the end of the 20th century, technology leapt forward. And this video from 2015 shows letters being automatically sorted into delivery order. Zip codes, introduced in 1963, were the building blocks of today's automated sorting technology. Zip codes were so revolutionary that the Post Office Department launched a massive publicity campaign to explain them to the American public and promote their use. Here's a clip from the 1960s explaining how zip codes worked, followed by a musical promo.
Prior to zip code, mail traveling overland became enmeshed in a network of obsolete, inefficient, time-consuming routes. Like an errant pinball, it bounced to be resorted and rebagged and delayed at every redistribution center. Mail held up, opportunities lost. The vast postal network at the point of paralysis. Patchwork, piecemeal solutions just wouldn't work. The answer had to come by way of revolutionary change. Zip code is just this, a revolutionary change. The country has been divided into 10 regional areas, an entirely new mail distribution concept. The key to this system is the 5-digit zip code number. Let's see how this one works. The first number, 2, indicates one of these regions. In this case, a portion of the East. The second and third digits, 12, pinpoint Baltimore, Maryland, a city within Region 2. 212, therefore, identifies the Baltimore sectional center. Sectional centers are carefully selected as transportation hubs of rail, highway, air, and even water. The last 2 digits of the zip code number indicate the final stop before delivery, a local post office. In this case, the 27 pinpoints the Halethorpe branch in Baltimore. 21227. When long-distance mail enters the new zip code mail system, it's as if a giant hand has ironed out the creases. It travels from sectional center of the sender to sectional center of destination with no intermediate stops for massing and sorting.
Zip code is bringing the mail explosion under control. It is as up-to-date as the computer. But to make zip code work, you must use it. Remember, only you can put zip in your postal system.
You've heard what we've said. Keep it all in your head. There's no better way. Use zip code every day. You know you gotta have a zip code on the envelope. A zip code so you won't just have to hope. A zip code morning, noon, and night, and everything will be alright.
Well, you get faster service and a lower cost. Fewer mistakes, no time ever lost. A lot less handling along the way.
No damage for you to pay.
You know you gotta have a zip code. Yeah, you're
on the envelope.
A zip code, yeah, so you won't have to hope. A zip code, yeah, morning, noon, and night, and everything will be alright. Well, meet a fella called Mr. Zip.
What he can do for you will really make you flip.
So if you have any further postal demands, we're gonna leave you in his hands. You know you gotta have a zip code. Yeah, you got a zip code. Yeah, so you gotta have a zip code. And everything will be alright.
Address information converted into digits, and digits converted into barcodes, enabled sorting equipment to read addresses and automatically sort letters at a rate of 15,000 pieces per hour per worker, versus about 1,700 pieces previously. Since the early 1980s, the Postal Service has lengthened the zip code, adding first 4 digits, then 2 more, represented by a longer barcode, which has enabled new equipment to sort letters not only to the correct delivery unit, but beginning in 1983 to the correct letter carrier, and beginning in 1990 to sort letters into delivery order. More recently, in 2006, the Postal Service began using a new type of barcode called the Intelligent Mail Barcode. It has 4 types of vertical bars instead of 2 and can hold nearly 3 times as much information.
In 1970, Congress passed the Postal Reorganization Act, which created the U.S. Postal Service as an independent federal agency. From start to finish, it took nearly 4 years and an illegal strike by more than 150,000 postal workers for the very stakeholders to finally compromise and enact postal reform. Winton Blunt, who was the Postmaster General at the time, later recalled, quote, "Short of world war, I cannot think of another endeavor that required the degree of common commitment that postal reform required." Many things have changed in the last 50 years, but some things haven't. Changing laws governing the Postal Service is still a challenge. Since 2009, the Postal Service has been on a list of high-risk federal agencies because of its worsening financial situation. Many of the Postal Service's expenses can't be reduced without legislative changes, but so far, the only thing that everyone has agreed on is that change is needed. Why can't everyone agree on the best way forward? Because there are thousands of stakeholders, millions if you count the American people. Different people want different things. While the difficulty in passing legislation has created hardships for the Postal Service, it tells me that even in the 21st century, when most mail is electronic, the future of the Postal Service is vitally important to most Americans. When I first spoke with Dr. Evans, she asked me why, given the importance of the Postal Service in American history, it's so often overlooked. In my opinion, the Postal Service has been overlooked because it's been taken for granted. Mail delivery is usually so regular, so reliable, that it's practically invisible. Horace Maynard, a University of Tennessee professor, later a U.S. representative from Tennessee, served as Postmaster General near the end of his public career in 1880. Maynard expressed a similar belief in his report to the president that year, and he stated, quote, "The Postal Service is so intimately connected with every public and private interest that its efficiency, like the purity of the air we breathe, is not demonstrated by popular applause so much as by the absence of complaints." In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted business as usual. In the weeks and months when many businesses temporarily halted operations, mail carriers conspicuously continued to deliver. Suddenly, the invisible became visible. Thank you notes and messages of appreciation began popping up along delivery routes nationwide. Some postal workers shared pictures with their coworkers, and we've been sharing them within the postal community because expressions of gratitude are powerfully motivating, especially in times of adversity. To end our presentation, we'd like to share a few of the pictures with you. Thank you for your attention.